Okay, shalom eretov, everybody. This is going to be an explosive night with Avi Lipkin. And there's going to be a lot of people watching online. Most people, I think, will be watching online. But long story, we welcome Avi back to Beit Derek. He's a good friend of ours, and we're very happy to receive him from Israel. And I hear this is going to be very explosive. So just, I don't know, put on your seatbelts, and we welcome Avi Lipkin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Avi.
Okay, typical greetings in Texas is Shalom Y'all. Shalom Y'all. Okay. I'm here primarily to talk about the elections in Israel and the elections in the United States. And it's interesting how the two elections are so different, and yet they are very similar in one fact, and that is that both nations, Israel and the United States, have a very, very polarized population. In other words, here it's Democrats, Republicans, and in Israel it's the conservatives and the religious versus socialist Arabs and certain breakaways from the Likud party. What I want to do, I want to first talk about the Israeli elections. As you all know, Israel was basically a very desolate, empty land 200 years ago, 150 years ago. And Mark Twain visited Israel in 1867, and he wrote a book called Innocents Abroad. And he said, if this is the promised land, I sure don't want it promised to me, because the country was very ugly. The land of Israel was desert, swamp, and bare mountaintops. The Turks had chopped down the trees, and the winter rains had washed the topsoil into the valleys, creating malarial swamps. Mark Twain walked for 2 full days without finding any human beings. That's how empty the land of Israel was. Most of the population, Arab, Christian, and Jew, were in walled cities. Anyone who dared to venture out of the walled cities was taking his life in his hands. In the mid-1800s, at the same time as Mark Twain visited the land of Israel, something very interesting was happening in Europe, in Eastern Europe. It was the beginning of communism and socialism. And what had happened was that many Jewish people in the 1850s, 60s, in Russia, in the Russian Empire, suffered from great persecution. And for those of you who remember Fiddler on the Roof, when Tevye would be in his loft, he would be yelling at God and saying, why did you choose us, the Jews, to be the chosen nation? Don't you know how much trouble that has caused us? The killings, the expulsions, the torturing. Why don't you just go, Tevye is saying to God, why don't you just go choose another people for a change, not the Jewish people? And many of these Jewish people decided to abandon God altogether. Because if we are so persecuted for being Jewish, for being called in God's name, then you know what do we need God for? That's what many people were saying. And so many of the early founders and supporters of communism and socialism, Marxism, these were Jewish people who thought the only way to utopia would be to abolish God, because God is to blame for all the persecution that the Jews are going through. And indeed, the early founders of communism, socialism, Marxism, many of them were Jewish. Many of the stalwart supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution were Jewish, because they thought that if you abolished God, all the hatred against the Jews would dissipate. One of the things I talk about here in America, and I know I shared it here already, why did the Jews vote Democrat? And everybody says, yeah, we want to know, why did the Jews vote Democrat? And I explain it like this. There are 2 types of Christianity. There is the Christianity of Europe, which killed its Jews, persecuted them, expelled them. And then there's the Christianity of America, which only loved and blessed the Jews. And indeed, many Jews came to America in the 1600s, and you find Jewish communities like Providence, Rhode Island, New Amsterdam, which is Dutch, New York it became, Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. These were the first 4 Jewish communities in America, and these are people who have been here for 500 years. In the American Revolutionary War, the Jews played a very, very major role. It's not publicized. But for example, in Valley Forge in 1777, 500 Jews stood bivouac while the Christians prayed their Christian services for Christmas. 500 Jews protected all of Valley Forge. In August or September, Yom Kippur, 1777, General George Washington comes to the Jews in Philadelphia and says to them, the American Revolution is bankrupt. If you Jews don't go home right now and bring your gold, all the gold you have, the British are going to hang you and they're going to hang us because the revolution is bankrupt. And the Jews went home on the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, and they came back with $30 million at that time of gold bullion. The Jews saved the American Revolution. And if you want to find out more about it, look up Chaim Solomon. Chaim Solomon was the Jew in Philadelphia who organized it. In the Civil War between the North and the South, there were so many Jews in the Confederate Army that when the Jews came to Jefferson Davis and said, we want to go home for our Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, he said, God forbid. If you Jews go home for your high holidays, the Confederate Army will collapse. That's how many Jews there were in the Confederate Army. President Lincoln established the Jewish chaplaincy in the Civil War. So you can see that the Jews were represented on both sides in the Civil War. And so when I'm in the churches and I look at the people in the churches and I say to them, where are those Jews today? And everybody looks in astonishment. Where are the Jews today? And I point my finger to everyone in the church like this. I say, all of you are the Jews who were here for 500 years. In other words, because the American ethic was to love God, love the Bible, love the Jews, love Jesus Christ, it's all together. So the Jews felt so welcomed that they intermarried with the Christians. Don't forget, Jews and Christians share the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jews and Christians share the Bible, at least the Old Testament. Jews have the Talmud, Christians have the New Testament, but for someone like me who has studied the New Testament and the Talmud, let me tell you, they are very similar. It's the same genre. And the Messiah is a Jew from Israel who speaks Hebrew. So we have all this in common. And sometimes I get very condemned for saying what I'm going to say now, but why should Jewish boys and girls not marry Christian boys and girls? And that's what happened in this country for 500 years. It's called assimilation. And so everybody in America today, at least people who claim that they're descendants from the early Americans, everybody has Jewish blood. So who are the Jews who vote Democrat? It's not those who were here for the 500 years. The people who vote Democrat are the Jews who came in the last 100 years. Where did they come from? Europe. What was happening in Europe? You had the Nazi Holocaust with the Germans. You had the persecution of the Russians from the Russian Orthodox Church. You had communism. You had the massacres of the Ukrainians, the massacres of the Poles. You had the Spanish Inquisition, the Catholic Inquisition. So many Jews who came here in the last 100 years thought that American Protestant Christians were the exact same as the Christians of Europe, which of course is not true, because the Christian Americans were good to the Jews, loved the Jews. The European Christians slaughtered the Jews, persecuted the Jews, tortured the Jews, and expelled the Jews. So why don't American Jews know the difference? And the answer is because I myself was one of those Jews who was taught that all Christians are bad. Only when I was 41 years old did I begin going to church. And all of a sudden I see Christians loving on Israel, loving on the Jewish people, loving on me. But that's not what I was taught in Hebrew school. My granddaughters, Aaron's daughters, come home from school and they say, Daddy, Grandpa, why do our teachers teach us that all Christians are bad? This is exactly what I went through 70 years ago, 60 years ago. There is a miseducation going on. And I'm going to be addressing this. It's ignorance. And I say to Jews, if you want to know who the Christians are, you have to go to church on Sunday. And so they say, oy vey, Avi is a Jew for Jesus. I say, I'm not a Jew for Jesus. But by going to church, I got to know the Christians and to realize how loving they were, how much they loved us. The American Christians are different. And so the answer of the Jews is, hey, we don't go to synagogue on Shabbat. Why should we go to church on Sunday? And then I say to the Jews, you need to read the New Testament. And they say to me, why should we read the New Testament? We don't read the Old Testament. So the answer for why Jews vote Democrat is ignorance. And Jews project the hostility and the anger of European history on the American Christians, which is wrong. Now, there's one of two possibilities. Either the Jews will not be killed in a Holocaust here in America. I predict, and I spoke about this last time I was here, that there's going to be a Holocaust in America. How many people remember that I talked about a Holocaust? Let's say there's no Holocaust. What happened in the last 500 years will continue in the future. Jewish kids are going to marry Christian kids. You know why? Because they go to college. And the genes speak louder than anything else. And so the Jewish kids marry the Christian kids. Same God, same Bible, Messiah is a Jew. And the Christians are full of love for the Jews. Obviously, if a person hates the Jews, he's not going to marry a Jew. When I was 15, this was in 1964, I corresponded with our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. And he said the Jews are going to assimilate in America and they're going to disappear after 2-3 generations, unless the Jews move to Israel. And I moved to Israel, and praise God, Rachel and I got married. We have Jewish kids and Jewish grandkids. But in America, a lot of Jewish kids, and there's nothing wrong with Christian kids, marry them, and very often they become Christian. Then they go to college, and then they vote Republican because they married Christians. Okay. And so I wanted to go back to Israel again. I did a little sidebar here with America, but I'm going to come back to America. The population of Israel was tens of thousands. There were always Jews in the land of Israel. There's the first Aliyah, second Aliyah, third Aliyah. World War I, the Turks kicked out a lot of Jews from the land of Israel. But what we saw happening was there were a lot of communist, listen to this, communist and socialist women and men coming from Russia because the Christians of Russia still hated them in spite of communism. There's a hatred against the Jews. It's not about God. It's about who we are. So they decided we are still communists, we are still socialists, and we're going to go to Israel, and we're going to bring the communist socialist utopia to the land of Israel. And we're going to drain the swamps, we're going to plant the trees, we're going to turn Israel green. And you want to know something? God used these ungodly people to do it. The communists and socialists who came to Israel, and I take my hat off to them, my kippah, these people did wonders to turn the land from a swamp and a desert into a Garden of Eden. And they were communists. They didn't have a kippah on their head. They didn't put on prayer shawl and phylacteries. They didn't keep kosher. They didn't keep Shabbat. And to this day, many of these socialists, they don't believe in God. Even Yitzhak Rabin, our prime minister, said that the Bible was just mythology and fairy tales. Our prime minister. It's not some person who is totally uneducated. It's a person who is indoctrinated by socialism and communism, that there is no God. 1922 was a watershed year, because who got elected in Europe? Mussolini. Mussolini, the Italian dictator, got elected in 1922 in fair, open elections. And then he turned Italy into a fascist dictatorship. And one of the things we saw in Europe, my BA in the university was about communism, socialism, and what was going on in Europe 100 years ago. You had street battles in all the countries of Europe between right and left. I'm afraid today in America, this is what we are facing. We are facing the possibility of street battles between right and left-wing forces. In the case of Italy, the fascists won and the communists were either expelled or destroyed. I'm not defending Hitler, but Hitler did the same thing in Germany in 1933. Anyone who was not a Nazi was eliminated. The communists and socialists were killed in the concentration camps. In Russia, it was the opposite. The communists won, and the free-thinking right-wing people and capitalists were eliminated. So in Israel, Israel was the mirror image of the Soviet Union of that time. The socialists controlled the little that there was in the way of economics. The socialists controlled the Palestine Mandate of the British. And people like myself, who were identified with the right wing, with the nationalists, we were persecuted. We were not given jobs. We were fired from jobs. Our kids were expelled from schools in Israel. I could give hours of what exactly the socialists did to us, to our people in Israel. 1948, Israel gets its independence, and we grew within 2 years from 648,000 people to 2.5 million people. That's a miracle, that 2 million people can come and live in such a small, impoverished land like Israel. Half of them were from the Holocaust survivors. Half of them were from Islamic countries. They weren't communists. They weren't socialists. From 1948 to 1977, we're talking about 30 years. Israel was still dominated by socialists and communists for another 30 years until 1977. And what happened was that eventually the religious and the right wing and the Jews who came from Islamic countries, most of them, banded together and they brought Menachem Begin to power. Menachem Begin was head of the Likud. And for the first time in the 50 years, from 1922 to 1977, 55 years, the communists and socialists were routed from the majority position that they had. And I will tell you another thing. If you go home and you look up the word Knesset, Knesset, by the way, is igreja in Portuguese, iglesia in Spanish, ecclesia in Greek. You think it means church. It means like a synagogue, a coming together. The Knesset is that all that is the same word. If you take a graph, you'll see that the numbers of the socialists and communists are decreasing with every election. And his last election in Israel, Meretz disappeared completely. Meretz was an extreme left party. The Israelis don't like socialism today. The Israelis today vote for liberal parties, or Likud, or the religious parties. And so something interesting happened. And I was in Israel in 1977. I was in Israel in 1968. I could see the growth of the right wing and the religious parties. And we were all rejoicing. How wonderful. In this last election, it was clear that out of 120 members of Knesset, Netanyahu had a block of 64. 64 is a majority. You need 61 to have a majority. In 1949, Ben-Gurion had a choice. Either Israel becomes a communist country and joins the Soviet bloc, which is what Stalin wanted, or Ben-Gurion breaks with the past and he becomes neutral in the Cold War between Soviet Russia and capitalist West, which is what he did. And to do that, instead of forming a government with a party called Mapam and the communists, he decided to form a party with economic liberals and with the Orthodox parties. That gave him the majority. So he set up a coalition without the communists and the extreme socialists. Stalin never forgave Israel. Stalin turned all his support over to the Arabs because Ben-Gurion decided to be neutral in the Cold War. Part of the deal to get the support of the Orthodox, you have to remember, we lost 6 million people in the Holocaust. Many of these people were yeshiva students in Europe who were minding their own business. They were just studying Torah, but Hitler killed everybody. And really, Hitler killed the cream of the crop of our yeshiva students. And so David Ben-Gurion decided that we have to resuscitate the population of the yeshiva students. And so the deal was, in 1949, that Israel would give 500 exemptions. Okay, now you're going to have to do some mathematics with me. 500 exemptions for yeshiva students not to go into the army. Their job was not to work, not to serve in the military, not to pay taxes. Their job was just to study Torah. Like priests, their whole life was like in the monastery. Out of a population of almost 700,000, there were 500 exemptions. Now, mathematics. From 700,000 today, we're 7 million, plus minus. How much is that? 10 times. So it figures that instead of 500, there should be 10 times that amount with exemptions. How much is 10 times 500? 5,000. You with me? 5,000 exemptions is what it should be. How many exemptions are there today for the yeshiva students? 140,000. 140,000, they don't work, they don't pay taxes, they don't serve in the army. All they do is study Torah, get married, and have children. And the rabbis profit from every child that is born. So we're talking about 74 years. That's 3 generations. Every 20 years is another generation that these ultra-Orthodox kids get married, have 10 children, they get married, they have 10 children each, they get married, so that's how we got to 140,000 yeshiva students. Have you ever envisioned going swimming with an anchor around your neck? The moment your body is outweighed by dead weight, you sink. You cannot swim with that. That is Israel today. Israel cannot afford to pay for 140,000 yeshiva students who don't serve in the army, don't pay taxes, but they do vote. They do what the rabbis tell them. Because the rabbis have a vested interest. Because the rabbis get paid for every soldier they receive. Are you with me? So we have a joke in Israel. Why do we have elections in Israel? To decide which parties will be the parties that form the coalition with the ultra-Orthodox. Because the ultra-Orthodox always will have a say in the government. I've been in Israel 54 years. I've seen the growth with my own eyes. These rabbis have armies of young men who are ready to die for their rabbis. Because whatever the rabbi says is gospel, excuse the expression. Whatever the rabbis say, that's what God is telling the world. And you know what? These yeshiva students are being taught that all Christians are bad. They hate the Messianics. They hate the Christians. And the reason for my message today, and why is it so explosive, is because when I created the Judeo-Christian Bible Bloc Party in Israel, I was saying, well, you know, the Messianics and the Christians need representation in the Knesset. But that's not the story. Now I realize God is telling me that is not the story. The story is that you have 6 million Jews in America. 1.5 million of them are Reform Jews. You've heard of Reform. 1 million are conservative. That's 2.5 million. 2.5 million are what they say unaffiliated Jews, don't belong to any synagogue. And 1 million are Orthodox. The rabbis want only the Orthodox Jews in Israel. Why? Because the 5 million Jews in America who are not Orthodox are married to 4 million Christians. 80% intermarriage with Christians. And if there is such a thing as the Holocaust in America and the Jews have to flee, can you imagine a Jew fleeing to Israel leaving the Christian spouse here? The Jew has to take the Christian spouse and the children. So that's 10 million people that the ultra-Orthodox rabbis in Israel, with their increasing power, are attempting to block. Okay, let's talk about the Holocaust. It breaks my heart. I wish I'm wrong. Maybe I am wrong, but I have a feeling I'm right. I have a feeling God is saying to me, go and preach it. I know I was here and I spoke about it. In 1999, and I'm making the story very short, I was in Canada, in Edmonton. And there's a story that I picked up there about an Egyptian Muslim woman doctor. And she was like Mother Teresa. She worked virtually for free. She fed the poor, she healed the sick in Cairo, Egypt. She did this for 20 years. She was in her 40s. Lo and behold, she had midlife crisis. And she decided to move to Canada because at age 40, she could still open a clinic in Canada, make some money, and retire at age 60, 65, 70. When she applied for a visa to emigrate to Canada, the people in the mosque heard about it, and they came to her, 3 jihadis, 3 holy warriors, and they said to her, oh, we know you're going to Canada. How did you know? We know everything about you. And you're going to work for us. And so the doctor asked them, what does that mean, I'm going to work for you? They said to her, well, when you open up a clinic, chiropractor, dentist, doctor, and people come to your clinic, they've got to fill out forms. You're going to know their names, their addresses, their telephone numbers, place of employment, address, telephone number, their economic data. Doctors know everything about you. And you're going to give all of this to us on a hard disk. This is 1999. And when a major war breaks out in the Middle East, we Muslims in Edmonton are responsible for killing the Jews and Christians in Edmonton. We're responsible for killing the Jews and Christians in Vancouver, Canada. We're responsible for killing the Jews and the Christians in America. Everywhere. Wherever there are Jews and there are Muslims, the Muslims have to catalog the Jews and Christians and prepare them for their deaths. That is the command of the jihad. And so the doctor said to them, listen guys, you know me. I go to the mosque every day, I pray, I give zakat. Zakat is a charity. I'm a good Muslim woman. But I swore the Hippocratic Oath to heal people and save lives. I don't believe in killing any human beings, even the Jews. So they said to her, oh, you don't want to work for us? She said, no. So standing next to her was another Muslim woman helping her in the clinic. And they pulled out a knife. They grabbed this woman, this friend of the doctor, and they slit her throat. She was on the ground with her blood gushing out, dead. And they pointed their finger at the doctor, said, if you don't work for us, this is what we're going to do to you. The next day, this Muslim woman doctor had asylum in the Canadian Embassy in Cairo, and the Royal Canadian Air Force flew in a private jet to pick her up and take her to Edmonton. And this Christian woman coming to the Orthodox Jewish synagogue tells me this story on Shabbat. And she went on to say that she works with the Canadian police. And the Canadian police say that 90% of the Muslims in Canada are as peacekeeping, law-abiding citizens. Only 10% are terrorists with salaries from the Middle East. Now, I don't know if you know how many Muslims there are in America. And I myself don't even know exactly how many there are, but I estimate that there are 30 million Muslims in America today. They've been coming in by program. Presidents of the United States, Republican and Democrat, have been helping charter jets to come in. They cross the borders. There are all kinds of ways. They come in through university grants. 90% are peacekeeping, law-abiding. 10% are terrorists. So if you have 30 million Muslims in America, that means you have 3 million terrorists who are armed and ready. North of Dallas is a city called Oklahoma City. I spoke there in a neighborhood called Yukon, and 4 policemen came up to me and said, we have to tell you something. Our friend, the sheriff in Tulsa, was responding to an alarm in a mosque in Tulsa. So he went down to the basement, door was open, he went in, the room was full of machine guns and ammunition. It was an armory. And the policeman called the FBI, and the FBI checked it out, said, you can't touch them. They have licenses for all their guns. And the New York Times came out with an article, why do Muslims buy machine guns? Because they feel that the Americans hate them. Now that's called logic, reverse logic. This is by plan. My wife Rachel picked up broadcasts over the last 4 decades. America was the great Christian Satan. That is going to change. America is going to become a Muslim nation, even if it takes us 150 years. That was 40 years ago. Then my wife said to me a few years ago, the same broadcast they picked up, and she said, they say, we thought it was going to take 150 years. We were wrong. It's only going to take us another 30 years to make America a Muslim country. I'm sorry to have to tell you these things. I live this with my wife every day because my wife is monitoring their broadcasts. They're coming in, they're coming in, they're coming in, and nobody even thinks about it. Nobody looks at it. 10% of them have guns, and they're going to kill the Jews. About a year ago, and I spoke about this last time I was here, I had dinner with a neo-Nazi. I didn't know he was a neo-Nazi until the very end. Actually, most of the discussion, we had similar right-wing views. And he said, Avi, you're a special Jew. You know why? Because you think like we think. And he said, we, I thought Americans. He was a militiaman. And he said to me, what do you think about the killing of George Floyd? I said, well, George Floyd was a criminal. He should have been in jail. But the police shouldn't have killed him. Later, it turns out that he probably died from some kind of a drug-related reaction to what was happening. which caused his heart to stop. What do you think about defund the police? And I said, well, I think it's horrible, because if you defund the police, you're going to have murders, you're going to have crime, you're going to have chaos. And he was shaking his head no. He said, Avi, you don't understand, he said. Before the killing of George Floyd, we had 3 million members in the militias. Today, we don't have 3 million. Today, we have 30 million. 30 million militia members armed and ready. And he said, the first thing we're going to do, we're going to kill the Jews. Because 70% vote Democrat. The Jews are socialists and communists and Bolsheviks, and they're traitors to America. That's what he said to me. I said, well, 30% of the Jews vote Republican. Why do you blame all the Jews? Because he's a neo-Nazi. And I said to him, I'm sorry, the moment you say you're going to kill all the Jews, how can I sit with you? I got up and I left. So let's do the mathematics. 30 million Muslims, 10% are terrorists. How much is that? 3 million. How many Jews are there in America? 6 million. The neo-Nazis, 30 million. How many are terrorists? Let's say 10%. 3 million. So 3 million militiamen and 3 million Nazis, 3 million Muslims, that's 6 million. Whereas the 90% are peacekeeping, law-abiding, but there are those people who want to settle accounts with the Jews. And then you have Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is an organization founded by Islamic Jihad. And what do they believe? That the Jews are slumlords. They believe that the Jews are the enemy of the black people, which is wrong, because the Jews are always in the forefront of the civil rights causes. And they're going to kill the Jews. And then there's a group called Antifa, communist anarchists. They're going to kill the Jews and the Christians. The one thing in common of all these terrorist groups, they want to kill the Jews. And what group is the only group in America that does not believe in having arms? The Jews. And I'm a Jew, and I come to people who will listen to me, like you all here. Jews won't listen to me. I said, I'll come and speak for free. Just let me warn. Let me warn the people. And the rabbi said, no. We don't want the Jews leaving the synagogues and moving to Israel. That's exactly what the rabbi said in Europe in the 1930s before Hitler killed everybody. I believe we're facing a Holocaust here in America. And one of the reasons for the Holocaust is because the Jews vote Democrat. The Jews show themselves to the rest of the patriotic Christian Americans that they are the enemy. And they flaunt it. And so why should we be surprised when people turn against us and kill our people? I live in Israel. I don't live here. But I've been here enough decades to understand how American Jews think and how Christians think. So Israel today has a population of 7 million Jews and 500,000 Christians. My political party's purpose is to give the 500,000 Christians representation in the Knesset. As I speak, this will be dating the broadcast, Netanyahu is on the cusp, on the verge of forming a coalition government. With whom? With religious parties. You have the Haredi parties, which are the ultra-Orthodox, and you have the national religious. They don't like Messianics. There are only about 10,000 Messianics. Some people say 15, some people say 20,000. Let me tell you, I don't see them anywhere. And they don't vote for my party. In the last elections 2 weeks ago, I got 400 votes. 10,000 Messianics. They all know about me. They all know about the Judeo-Christian party. There are 40 political parties in Israel. My party is the only party that has Christian candidates. And they didn't vote for me. They voted for the anti-vaccination party in the last elections. Not this last one, the one before. That party isn't even running this time. Now they voted for another party with some brilliant professors. Wonderful. But when the time comes to kick out the Messianics from Israel, to kick out the Christians from Israel, who's going to help them? The only party that will even think about it is the Judeo-Christian Bible Bloc, which is my party. And that they don't vote for it because they're afraid. I'm a Jew and I'm not afraid to represent them. But the Christians and the Messianics are afraid, or they're just snobby. I don't know what their problem is. I have a very dear friend, Christine Darg. I don't know how many of you have heard of Christine Darg. She said to me, Avi, be patient. Things look black now, but the day is going to come that you're going to have a tsunami of votes. Because the ultra-Orthodox today and the National Religious Party today not only hate the Messianics and the Christians, but they hate the Reformed Jews, the conservative Jews, the unaffiliated Jews, the national religious Jews. You know what they call us? They call us Amalek. Because we're not black kippah like they are. And even the black kippah or ultra-Orthodox, they hate each other because they're all fighting for budgets from the government. Who has the most soldiers? And their intention is to turn Israel into Iran, a Jewish Iran, a Jewish theocracy. Democracy is not part of their language. Democracy is a Judeo-Christian Western ethic. And that's the ideology of my party. Remember Don Quixote, to dream the impossible dream, man of La Mancha. What I'm doing is to dream the impossible dream. Israel will not survive if we don't do something about it. I don't know when the next elections will be, but I'm going to continue fighting this. I'm going to continue going to meetings, continue campaigning like the elections are tomorrow. The people in Israel have to be awakened. And this is not a problem just of Messianics and Christians. We cannot stand by and watch as 10 million Americans get slaughtered by neo-Nazis and Muslims and Black Lives Matter and Antifa. I don't know, maybe nothing's going to happen. Maybe everything will be just fine until the 2024 elections. Personally, I'm very afraid. And I've got friends who have said to me, you may agree, you may disagree, you may not know or understand. How many people here heard of QAnon? And they said to me, all these Democrats are going to be arrested and shot. Wonderful. But you know what the problem is? Of these Democrats, many of them are Jews. I don't want to see my Jewish people shot. I want to see them on a plane going to Israel. I don't know how we're going to do this. I don't know if there will be such a QAnon coup or takeover. I don't know what will happen in 2 years if we last 2 years here in America. And if Trump gets reelected, I don't know if the left will do crazy stuff. But let me tell you something. Christians and patriotic Jews have had it up to here with the transgender and the anti-petroleum and all the things that the Democrats are doing. This country is ripe for a civil war. I pray to God I'm wrong. My concern, though, as a Jew and as an Israeli, is to get these Jews out of the country and take them to Israel. Okay, what's the other problem? But if the ultra-Orthodox don't want them in Israel, and the ultra-Orthodox change the laws regarding the return of the Jews to Israel, then these Jews are stuck. And the Christians who are with them are stuck. And they will be killed here in the Civil War, if there's a civil war here. I don't know if I'm saying crazy stuff. Maybe you don't agree with me. I don't know. You don't stop me. If I was in a Jewish community speaking, I'd be shut down very fast. So we have the possibility of a Holocaust, perhaps an immediate Holocaust in America, maybe yes, maybe no. It's a process. And all you need is a spark. One major spark, and everything goes nuts in this country. I pray to God it doesn't happen, because what the Russians and the Chinese want is that America self-destructs to a civil war. On the other hand, the Russians on the verge of a civil war. People are not happy with what Putin is doing. The Chinese people are not happy with Xi Jinping. The Iranian people are not happy with their regime. So the question is, which countries are going to collapse first? Who's going to survive? I believe America will survive. But it doesn't change the fact that either the Jews move to Israel or they intermarry and they disappear from the history books. And I will say that if 10 million Jews and Christians move to Israel, you know what? The 7 million Jews today, I would say about a third of them are ultra-Orthodox. Third, who are not working. So if we can get 10 million Jews and Christians to move to Israel, this will be a good counterbalance democratically to prevent them from taking over the country. One of the things they're going to do, they're going to shut down the Reform and Conservative temples. Anyone who's not like they are, it's going to be like, how many people heard of the Catholic Inquisition? Israel will be like a Catholic Inquisition country. It'll be like in Iran. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about something slightly different. My wife Rachel, for those of you who have heard me here before or know me, know that my wife worked for the Israeli intelligence in Arabic. And you know that ISIS had its caliphate in Syria and Iraq. And praise God, you know, the American government did a good job together with the Russians and others. And ISIS was pretty much crushed in Syria and Iraq. But ISIS is the fruit of Orthodox Islam. And in Saudi Arabia, for example, 92% of the Saudi people, 92% of the Saudi people support ISIS. 8% support the king of Saudi Arabia and his family. 92% want to kill him and remove them. And ISIS will take over Saudi Arabia with all its oil. Do you think America will be able to live without the Saudi oil? President Biden does not have a clue. They're going to kill King Abdullah of Jordan. He's also an infidel and a heretic in their eyes. Jordan and Saudi Arabia will become part of this new caliphate of ISIS. The Russians are being debilitated by the war in Ukraine, and eventually the Russians will not be able to support Syria anymore, who are the Shiites, Christians, and Druze. ISIS will take Syria. When ISIS takes Syria, they'll take Lebanon. When they take Syria and Lebanon, ISIS will kill all the Christians, all the Druze, and all the Shiites. And then they're going to turn their guns on Israel from all directions. So the big war is coming. You know, I have to tell you a little story. I'm not saying the Russians are the good guys. But if you remember, at the beginning of the civil war in 2011 in Syria, there was a mountain in the south of Syria called Mountain of the Druze, D-R-U-Z-E. And the Druze people there, 700,000, were surrounded by ISIS. And ISIS hates the Druze because they're heretics and infidels. They have to be killed. And they were going to wipe out everybody on that mountain. So the Israeli Druze came to Netanyahu and said to Netanyahu, listen to this. They were demanding from Netanyahu that Israel should invade Syria. What does it mean, invade Syria? Go east in the direction of the Euphrates River and protect the Druze on the mountain of the Druze. And the Druze said to Netanyahu, if you don't do that, let us go. We will volunteer, we will cross the border with our weapons, and we will fight ISIS alongside our brethren on the mountain of the Druze. You know what Netanyahu did? Netanyahu flew to Moscow, met with Putin, and they agreed. the Russian army would pour into Syria to defend the Christians, the Druze, and the Shiites. Nobody talked about it. And the Sunnis were destroyed. The Sunnis were defeated. Syria was a country of 20 million people. 10 million of them had to flee. There were 500,000 dead people in the civil war. But the success of Netanyahu was that Israel did not have to go in. I'm contending that if Russia has to pull out from Syria because of its weakness now, because of the war with the Ukraine, ISIS will come back. And when ISIS comes back, Israel will have to invade eastward, meaning Jordan, Syria, and northward to Lebanon. Lebanese also. They're Sunnis, they're Shiites, they're Druze, and they're Christians. Israel is the one that's going to have to make order if the Russians pull out. You know, I have to be careful how I speak, because when I say that our borders are going to go from the Nile to the Euphrates, everyone says he's crazy. You know what my worst enemy is? The Jewish mother. The Jewish mother does not want her children in Damascus or in Amman or in Riyadh or in Beirut. The Jewish mother wants her kids close to home for Shabbat dinner. In Florida, they call it a golf carts ride away. We Jews are not fascists. We Jews are not conquerors. We don't want to conquer all these countries surrounding us. But if ISIS takes over in these countries, we have no choice. And you know what? We're going to need the 10 million Jews and Christians. The ones who want to come on Aliyah or will be forced to make Aliyah, we need them. Am I crazy? I don't know if you know this or not. Sfaradim, there are 40 million of them who want to come to Israel. Now, in the little sliver of land that we call Israel today, there's very little room for everybody. But when God forces us to take Saudi and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, and maybe the Sinai Peninsula, we're going to need tens of millions of immigrants. Jews, Christians, and Judeo-Christians. And we're going to settle these areas. My dream, my idea, and you've never heard this from anyone else, nor will you for now, I want to establish the United States of Israel. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi will have population of Jews and Christians who will go and live there when they make Aliyah. Lebanon will be restored as a Christian federal autonomous republic of Israel. Syria will be a federal autonomous republic of Israel. United States of Israel, there are going to be many states joining the state of Israel. And Christians will be welcome to live with us. You want to see me get off the plane in Tel Aviv in 2 weeks? It's not what I want. I think it's what God wants. People say, well, it's desert. We're going to turn the desert green. How are you going to turn the desert green? Well, we have the sun. We have solar energy. You know, we Jews are kings in the solar energy. We have desalination perfected. We can use the solar energy and desalinate all that seawater. By the way, when we do that, the level of the oceans won't go up. The level of the oceans will go down. Because all that sweet water is going to be used to turn the deserts green. God says in the book of Genesis to Adam and Eve, you will tend my garden. The deserts of the Middle East are not gardens. The deserts of the Middle East are deserts created by the stupidity of man. And it says in Isaiah, it says also in Genesis 12:3 that the blessings to all the nations will come from the children of Abraham, which includes the Christians. Desalinate the water, turn the desert green. From the tip of Arabia all the way to Turkey, it's going to be green. It's going to take a few generations. I'm thinking to myself, are we the generation that's going to see the Messiah? I don't know. But I think the Messiah is saying to us that at this present state, we are not deserving to see him. After Jews and Christians stop hating each other, and when Jews and Christians start marching together, and when we fulfill the commandments that God is commanding us to fulfill, and to turn those deserts green and desalinate the water, and spread the knowledge of desalination to all the desert nations in the world, then God will say, "You've done well, my son." Do you want God to say to you, "You've done well, my son"? I think you do. The Messiah is not going to stand on the Mount of Olives only for the Jehovah's Witnesses. He's not going to stand only for the Southern Baptists. You know the difference between Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists. Northern Baptists go to hell. That's a Texas joke. The Messiah is not coming only for the Jews. You know, many rabbis are going to be very surprised when they hear me say that. The Messiah is coming for everyone. And everyone has to be at the foot of the Mount of Olives to receive him. We got to do our homework and we have to get ready. That's the purpose of my party. That's the purpose of what I'm doing. And if I die tomorrow, I've almost died 10 times already. If I die tomorrow, so someone else will continue. But this is the idea in its inception. I see it so clearly. The Middle East can and should be the Garden of Eden. Jews and Christians should love each other. God never told us to hate each other. God told us to love each other. And so I'm here in Texas. I don't know how many trips I have yet to make in my lifetime. I'm doing the best I can. I don't know how long Netanyahu's government will stand until the ultra-Orthodox commit some really crazy mistakes and new elections are called again. At some stage, I don't know if it's fair to say there should be a separation of synagogue and state. But the country today is very divided, and people who are free thinkers do not support what's going on. And the free thinkers, unfortunately, are in the minority today because the vast majority are Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, and nationalist. And I have to tell you, the immigration to Israel, the Jews who came to Israel, half came from Soviet socialist countries, half came from Islamic countries. Forgive me for saying it like this, but there are no, or almost no, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Jews living in Israel. I'm one of them, who grew up on the lap of the American Revolution. No taxation without representation. The people have to have a system based, I believe, on what made America great. Have the people follow the Soviet model? Have the people follow the Islamic model? Because of that, we are in the mess that we are in now. I don't have the answers. At this point, I'm just asking the questions. How are we going to do this? What can we do? What can we not do? And meanwhile, we still face the possibility of an all-out war. I wanted to say another thing also. I don't know if I spoke about this here. Did I talk about Turkey when I was here last time? And I have to say it. For those of you who know the history of the Sunnis and the Shiites, you understand why the Sunnis and the Shiites hate each other and why they have been fighting each other for 1,400 years. Today, ironically, the countries making peace with Israel are the Sunni countries. The Abraham Accords are with Sunni countries. The Shiite countries are Iran, Syria, I don't want to say Lebanon because Lebanon is 40% Shiite, but the rest are not Shiites. Iran, Iraq, Syria. And the Shiites are 15% of Islam. The Sunnis are 85%. Now, we're not enemies of anybody. People choose to be friends or enemies. The Shiites are enemies because they chose to be. But the Shiites have to understand, if they're 15% and the Sunnis are 85%, and the Sunnis march with Israel, that's very bad for the Shiites. The Shiites will be finished. And I'm going to say something else about Russia. The Russians have been allies of Iran for a long time. Why? Because the enemy of my enemy is my ally. The Iranians are Shiites and they're enemies of Turkey, which is Sunni. The Russians have been fighting the Turks for 1,000 years. That's why I don't think that Russia is the Armageddon. Many Christians say Russia is the Armageddon. Russia is not the Armageddon. The Turks are. The Russians today are 140 million people, mostly Orthodox Christians. 140 million. The Turks are 70 million in Anatolia and 200 million Turkic people in the 6 republics that broke away from Russia. That's 270 million. I think that the Turks are going to try to invade Cyprus again. And the Turks are going to send their navy like they did in 1974. But this time, the Turks will be faced not only by the Cypriots and the Greeks, they'll be faced by Israel. You all know that we have a gas pipeline going from Israel to Cyprus to Greece to Italy. And the Turks say, no, it's ours. There was a battle in 1571 called the Battle of Lepanto. And the Venetian and Spanish navies in 1571 sank the entire Turkish fleet. This was the beginning of the end of the Turkish Empire. Today, whoever controls the air controls the battle. In those days, whoever controlled the seas controlled the battle. I think as a result of Lepanto II, which is what my 8th book is, God willing, going to be called, the Turkish navy will be sunk. Israel will be victorious. The problem is this will spark the Armageddon. And then hundreds of millions of Muslims, Sunni Muslims, are going to attack Israel from the north, which is what it says in the Bible. Can you begin to understand why it's so important that Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia have big Christian populations, and Israel has to use its brains to bring the Christians to the Middle East? Create a United States of Israel, Christian autonomous republics under the flag of Israel. I think this is what God wants. I think this is what the Messiah wants. And if we have such a coalition of Judeo-Christian states, we have a better chance of defeating the Turks when the Turkish relations with Israel go south. And they can go south at any moment. And we shouldn't rule out Russia as an ally for this, because the Russians have a 1,000-year history of wars with the Turks. Am I shocking you, or I'm just saying this is something that I think about all the time. We are approaching a time in which Jews and Christians will flee the U.S. We are approaching a time in which the rabbis in Israel have to be controlled, not let them control us. There is going to be a time when the Shiites will be the allies, when the Iranian regime is overthrown and the people of Iran say, let's renew our relations with Israel. There's a country which is Shiite called Azerbaijan. I don't know how many of you have heard of Azerbaijan. They're oil rich. They just opened an embassy in Tel Aviv. They're Shiite Muslims. So this is something that we need to look at. Today, Israel is with the Sunnis against the Shiites. Tomorrow, the Shiites in Israel, I think, will be defending themselves from the Armageddon Sunni onslaught. I'm just throwing out some ideas that I think we need to think about. All of these things, the Armageddon War, all of these things are together with the coming or the return of the Messiah. But I do know one thing. Either the Jews and the Christians learn to hang together, or we're going to hang separately. And we Jews and Christians have to stop hating each other. This has to stop. And yet my granddaughters come home from school. Why did the teachers teach us that all Christians are bad? Crazy. That's the direction Israel is going in today. So I want to thank God for allowing me to live this long. I almost died 10 times between the military and traffic accidents and sicknesses. My wife didn't kill me. That's good. She's been my teacher. She's very strict with me, but very good. And I'm hoping that together, Rachel and I will continue to do the work that we're doing, because we are a team. I would not be alive without Rachel today. I would not have my books on the table without Rachel today. And I'm very, very thankful that you all have had me here. Look up my website, which is Biblical Alliance of the Jews and the Christians. And my party is the Bible Block Party. So keep us in your prayers. And for those of you who can support it, it's your party. And come to Israel with Lipkin Tours, and I will see you all in Israel before the New Jerusalem. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Are there any questions? Any questions? If not, thank you very much. We can continue at the book table.